What if the most expensive ring in California wasn't lost, but taken back? Let that sit for a second. Because according to whispers coming out of Montecito, something explosive didn't just happen behind closed doors, it detonated. And when the dust settled, one thing was missing. Not just a person, a symbol, a ring that once screamed defiance, unity, and rebellion against an entire institution. Now, it's allegedly no longer on her finger. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. So here's the question no one is asking out loud. Why would a man who once gave up everything for love suddenly demand it all back? Picture the scene. A quiet Montecito night. No paparazzi flashes. No charity galas. No carefully curated smiles. Just silence hanging thick in the air of a mansion that once represented freedom. Except freedom, as it turns out, comes with walls. And those walls were closing in. This story matters now because something shifted. The tone changed. The public appearances slowed. The smiles stopped reaching the eyes. And suddenly, reports began circulating that didn't sound like rumors anymore. They sounded final. Not separation energy. Endgame energy. Ask yourself this. Have you ever noticed how the loudest breakups start with silence? For years, the narrative was airtight. Us against them. Love conquers all. We walked away together. But behind that carefully maintained image, cracks were forming. Contradictions piling up. Moments where the story didn't quite match the reality. Moments where support looked more like pressure. Partnership began to feel like performance. And here's the uncomfortable part. Sometimes the person who gives up the most is the one who eventually snaps. Sources close to the situation suggest this wasn't a sudden blow-up. It was a slow burn. Months, maybe longer, of resentment layered under forced calm. Of compromises that didn't feel mutual. Of a man who had already lost his country, his role, and much of his family, realizing he might be losing himself too. So when people say furious, don't imagine chaos. Imagine clarity. Cold. Focused. The kind of anger that doesn't shout, it decides. And then there's the ring. The ring wasn't just jewelry. It was a statement. A line drawn in the sand. A promise wrapped in history and symbolism. Taking it back doesn't say, I'm hurt. It says this chapter is over. Which raises a chilling question. If the ring was demanded back, what else was taken? Because demanding the ring isn't about possession. It's about power. About who gets the last word. About who controls the narrative when the cameras aren't rolling. And that brings us to the moment everything allegedly changed. The conversation that didn't end with tears, but with instructions. The night when love wasn't renegotiated, it was revoked. Because when he finally spoke, it wasn't what she expected. And it wasn't a request. So what happens when fury doesn't explode? It settles? Here's what insiders describe. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. No slammed doors. No shouting match echoing through marble halls. Just a pause. A long one. The kind where both people realize something irreversible is about to be said. According to accounts whispered among those close enough to hear the aftermath, this wasn't a fight that spiraled out of control. It was a confrontation that finally arrived on schedule. Think about that for a moment. How many times do we assume breakups happen because of one bad night, one argument, one mistake? But what if this was the opposite? What if this night only mattered because of everything that came before it? The evening reportedly began like so many others in Montecito. Controlled, polite, almost rehearsed. Two people in the same space, living parallel lives, carefully avoiding the landmines that had been planted months ago. But something was different. The tension wasn't being managed anymore. It was being measured. And then came the shift. Not raised voices, but direct ones. Not accusations, but conclusions. Sources say Harry wasn't pacing. He wasn't emotional in the way tabloids love to imagine. He was still, calm. And that calm was unsettling. Because when someone who has swallowed frustration for years finally stops swallowing, what comes out isn't chaos. It's resolve. The words that followed weren't about love or betrayal. They were about boundaries, about ownership, about what could no longer continue under the same roof. And then came the sentence that allegedly froze the room. The ring. Not screamed. Not demanded in anger. Requested, firmly. As if it were overdue. As if it were no longer hers to wear. As if the meaning behind it had expired. Ask yourself, what would that feel like? 1 second, a symbol of permanence is sitting on your hand. The next, It's being reclassified as property. Evidence of a contract that no longer applies. Those close to the situation say Meghan didn't immediately react. No tears. No outburst. Just a pause that lasted a beat too long. The kind of pause that signals shock colliding with calculation. Because when power shifts suddenly, the first response isn't emotion, it's assessment. And here's the contradiction no one can ignore. If this were just about anger, the ring wouldn't matter. If this were just about separation, it could wait. But asking for it back that night? That wasn't sentimental. It was symbolic. It was Harry saying, "This doesn't represent me anymore." And that's when the conversation reportedly took another turn. Because the ring wasn't the end of it. It was the prelude. What came next wasn't about marriage at all. It was about space. Physical space. Legal space. And whether Meghan would still be allowed to occupy the one place that had come to define their post-royal identity. Because when the ring left her hand, something else was already being taken off the table. And the next words out of his mouth made that painfully clear. What does it really mean when someone tells you to leave, without raising their voice? Because according to people familiar with what unfolded next, this wasn't a dramatic expulsion. No bags thrown. No shouting match. No scene that neighbors could overhear. In many ways, that's what made it more unsettling. The message was clear. Calm. Non-negotiable. This wasn't a separation conversation anymore. This was a boundary being enforced. Montecito wasn't just a house. It was the symbol, the fortress, the proof of concept that leaving the royal system had worked. The place where a new brand, a new identity, a new life was supposed to flourish. And now, that same place had become the battleground. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people miss. Whoever controls the space controls the narrative. Sources suggest Harry framed it not as punishment, but as necessity. That staying under the same roof was no longer possible. That distance wasn't optional, it was required. And that requirement wasn't temporary. Let that sink in. Because when someone is asked to leave the shared home, especially one so closely tied to public image and power, it's not about cooling off. It's about reclaiming territory. Observers say this moment revealed a version of Harry rarely seen. Not reactive, not emotional, focused, deliberate, almost detached. The kind of clarity that only comes after someone has already made the decision privately and is now just executing it out loud. And Meghan? Reports suggest she didn't argue. Not immediately. Instead, she listened, took mental notes, measured the consequences. Because shock doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like someone realizing the chessboard has just been flipped. Ask yourself this. If you believed you were the one steering the story, how would it feel to realize the steering wheel had quietly changed hands? What's striking is how little was allegedly said. No grand speeches. No ultimatums. Just facts. Timelines. Next steps. The kind of language used when something has already moved past the emotional phase. And that's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. For years, Harry was portrayed as the follower. The one pulled along by love, loyalty, or rebellion. Yet here he was, allegedly drawing lines, defining terms, deciding who stays and who goes. And here's the part that raised eyebrows among those close to the situation. The request to leave wasn't framed as mutual. It wasn't "we need space." It was directional. One person stays. One person goes. Which begs the question no one wants to ask out loud. If Meghan was told to leave, where exactly was she supposed to go? Because that detail matters. A lot. And according to whispers, Harry already had an answer. But that answer wasn't about logistics. It was about leverage. And once that became clear, the real fallout was only just beginning. So what happens after someone is told to leave and realizes the exit isn't temporary? Here's where the story takes a turn most people didn't expect. Because the moment Meghan was no longer physically inside Montecito, something else happened almost immediately. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The strategic kind. The kind that signals moves are being made behind closed doors, calls are being placed, and narratives are being quietly prepared. Think about it. In a world where every appearance is calculated, every word is filtered, sudden absence speaks louder than any press release. According to those watching closely, the aftermath didn't look chaotic. It looked controlled. Too controlled. No dramatic rebuttals. No emotional leaks. Just a noticeable shift. Fewer sightings. Delayed responses. A vacuum where certainty used to be. And that vacuum? It started pulling attention fast. Because when two people who built their brand on visibility suddenly go quiet, people ask questions. And when only one of them seems steady while the other fades into the background, speculation fills the gaps. Here's the contradiction that made insiders uneasy. If this was mutual, why did the silence feel so one-sided? If this was a shared decision, why did one narrative keep moving while the other stalled? Sources suggest Harry's posture changed almost overnight. Not louder, not defensive, just firm, as if the weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. Meanwhile, Meghan's next steps appeared delayed, cautious, almost reactive. Ask yourself this. When power shifts, who rushes to speak? And who waits? What followed, according to whispers, wasn't emotional fallout. It was reputational fallout. Advisors getting involved. Messaging being workshopped. Long-term implications suddenly becoming urgent. Because when a private rupture threatens a public identity, the real damage isn't emotional, it's strategic. And then there's the ring. Because once the ring was gone, something irreversible had occurred. That symbol couldn't be reinterpreted. It couldn't be spun. You either have it, or you don't. Insiders claim that request alone sent shockwaves through every layer of planning that had been built around the marriage. Deals, appearances, future projections. All of it suddenly required recalculation. And here's the part that caught even seasoned observers off guard. Harry didn't follow up. No olive branch. No softening statement. No backtracking. The absence of reassurance was the message, which raises a chilling question. What if this wasn't a reaction at all? What if it was the final move in a decision made long before that night? Because if that's true, then the confrontation, the ring, the eviction, they weren't emotional responses. They were steps. Steps in a process already underway. And if that process continues, the next phase won't happen quietly. It won't stay private. And it won't be something either of them can control. Because once a story like this breaks containment, it doesn't just change relationships. It changes legacies. And what comes next may be the one thing Harry can never take back, no matter how furious he was when this all began. So let's go back to the question we started with. What if the ring wasn't taken in anger, but in clarity? Because when you strip away the rumors, the noise, the speculation, what's left is something far more unsettling. This wasn't a tabloid-style meltdown. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't even revenge. It was a line being drawn by someone who had already lost too much to keep pretending. Think about the irony. The marriage that was supposed to symbolize freedom from control may have become the very thing that felt suffocating. The home meant to represent independence became the battleground for ownership. And the ring that once stood for defiance against tradition became the object that marked its end. There's a reason this moment hit so hard. It forced people to reconsider the roles they thought they understood. The idea of Harry as passive, of Meghan as the driver, of their relationship as unbreakable because it survived exile, pressure, and public judgment. That narrative cracks when one person calmly says, "This stops now." And here's the emotional truth that lingers beneath all of it. Sometimes the loudest breakups aren't dramatic. They're decisive. They happen when someone finally chooses themselves after years of compromise. When fury isn't explosive, it's focused. Ask yourself this. How many times have we seen someone endure quietly, only to shock everyone when they finally act? The ring wasn't about money. It wasn't about possession. It was about reclaiming meaning, about saying, "This symbol no longer represents my truth." And once that happens, there's no way to pretend the relationship still exists in the same form. That's why this story doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a pivot. Because the consequences of that night in Montecito won't be confined to private conversations or quiet exits. They ripple outward, into reputations, into alliances, into how history remembers who stood where when everything fell apart. And the most haunting part? Neither of them can fully control what happens next. Once power shifts publicly, once symbols are reclaimed, once silence replaces spin, the story takes on a life of its own. And legacies, especially royal-adjacent ones, are fragile things. They're shaped not just by what you do, but by how you leave. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Was this the moment Harry finally took his life back, or the moment everything he built began to unravel? Because depending on what comes next, This won't just be remembered as a furious demand for a ring. It will be remembered as the night the story changed direction forever. If you have thoughts, theories, or details you think the world is missing, drop them in the comments. If this story made you rethink what you thought you knew, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who's been following this saga from the beginning. Because this chapter may be complete, but the fallout? That's only just beginning.